Okay guys, so the other day we started working on our project, which is painting candy as our subject matter. Before we get too deep into this project, I just wanted to give you guys a couple pointers to help you succeed on this. So first thing let's talk about is our brushes. For the most part, I'm going to be using these three brushes. So I have my square-headed brush, my angled brush, and then a tapered brush. You have these larger brushes with your brush kit. I wouldn't use these unless you're trying to cover a large area of space. Most of our painting, you're going to be wanting to use the smaller brushes because we're going to be doing a lot of detail work. First thing I wanted to talk to you guys about when you're painting is doing your color blocking. So I know some of you started this yesterday, but color blocking or underpainting is when you're basically just looking for the main color of each object and painting that object with one color. Now with that being said, you may have to mix some colors. This is not just all solid red. This is red and yellow, plain red, and then red with a little bit of black right here. So you can kind of see the color differentiation happening. When you guys are doing your underpainting, you always want to start with your background and then work your way to the foreground. So the foreground is your front area, your midground is all the middle stuff, and then your background is all the stuff in the back. So you want to work back to front, so your front objects will be overlapping everything else. As far as your background color goes, you probably can't see it very well on here, but I just did watered down white with a little bit of yellow to make just kind of a nice warm background. You don't want to draw too much attention to the background. It's just kind of there. You don't want to take away from the candy, which is our main subject matter. So do something that's really light and subtle, and I watered it down just to make it thin. Now when you guys are starting your color blocking and you might be going into more detail now, I wanted to talk to you about a couple things. First one is objects that are blurred. These can be a little challenging because if you're looking at your photo and you have all these blurred objects, it can be tricky to figure out how to do that. So what I'm going to do, I'll show you on this like bright green and blue gummy candy. I went ahead and mixed up my paint for that, so it was just a little bit of dark blue, some of the bright blue, and then some yellow to make that really bright, vibrant blue. Now I'm going to be taking my tapered brush and just lightly painting that in. I'm not doing a heavy coat of paint. So I'm just painting in the object, and then when you're ready to start dry brushing, so getting those blurry edges, I'm actually going to rinse my brush out, dry it off, and then I'll go in with just the smallest amount of white on my bristles, and I'm going to start to blur out those edges. So I'm just going to go where the edge of my candy meets the paper plate and start to blur those out. So I have just a little bit of white on my brush, and I'm just going on the edges, going back and forth to make them look fuzzy. And this is a dry brush technique that we practiced when we first started our acrylic painting unit. Okay, and I would go ahead and do that for my starburst and then this candy back here as well. So it should look out of focus. The next thing I wanted to talk to you guys about was shadows. So most of your candies, especially in the foreground, are going to have shadows, okay? So you really need to look at your photo when you're doing this, because some shadows can have more of a warm tone, so more of like a reddish tone, and then some can have more of a cooler tone with blue. The way I like to mix up paint for shadows is to start with kind of a brownish color. So the way you get brown is by taking blue, a little bit of blue, some yellow, and lots of red, and it's going to give you kind of this reddish brown color right here. So once I've got some brown made up, I'm going to make a little pile of brown over here and add some white, and then just the smallest dot of black. So you're kind of going for like a grayish brown color for your shadows. Shadows are usually not done with pure black. I know a lot of people think, oh, you just use black to make shadows. Not always, depending on the light in the room that you're in. And when I'm doing shadows, I like to water down the paint a little bit because shadows are really thin. And while you're doing this, you need to be looking at your reference photo. So in my photo, it shows me that the shadow is darker, the closest to the gummy worm. So I'm going to paint that darker. And shadows don't have to be perfect, they're kind of blobs. Then I'm going to rinse out my brush, dry it off, and I'm just going to use my clean brush to pull that shadow out a little bit. So as I get out further, my shadow will start to thin out. The shadow should be darkest where it meets the object. So I have no paint on my brush right now. I'm just using this watered down mixture to pull this shadow out a bit. Okay? So that's how you do shadows. When you guys go to start adding highlights to your stuff, I like to just take a watered down version of whatever color I'm trying to use. So most highlights will be white, but not always. So what I mean by that, on this gummy candy down here, the highlights are actually going to be a light green. So I'm going to take yellow, blue, and then lots of white to make almost like a pastel green. Now the trick to doing highlights, especially on gummies, because they kind of have that see-through quality, I'm going to water down my paint once again. And I'm going to start adding highlights wherever I see them on my photo. The good thing working with this watered down mixture too, if you mess up, it's pretty easy to just wipe away. I'm not saying that you always have to work with a watered down mixture, but when you're doing things like highlights, sometimes it's good because it gives it a very subtle look. And then I'll go back with a clean and dry brush and just kind of dab these out a little bit. And then for highlights, like if I'm trying to do this red candy, add some highlights, I'm going to switch to a smaller brush since I'm doing more details. And just do some white highlights. I did part of this at home. I watered down my white for kind of my bottom layer, and then you can go back with just plain white and add some highlights on top so they're more detailed. So if I did this highlight and I think it's too bright, I'm just going to take my paintbrush and a little bit of water and start to kind of fade it out a little bit. Okay, so these are just some tips to help you with your painting.